G'day, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. The iOS Beginners course assumes you know nothing about iOS development and steps you through the process of developing a login screen. In the first session, we are going to be dealing with storyboards, which we use to visually create our screens. Then we will anchor and constrain our user interface items so they will look great on all the different screen sizes for the iPad and iPhone. Finally, we'll link those visual objects to our source code so we can manipulate them programmatically. Before we get started, if you'd like to get a copy of our code, just go into Xcode, source control, clone, type in the following, and you'll be able to clone down one.storyboard, put it on your desktop, and you'll have a full working copy of what we're going to be looking at today. G'day again. We are going to start off with storyboards, and through this series of tutorials we're going to build up a login screen. Essentially pretty much every app these days has got some form of login screen, so we're going to start off with a simple username, password and buttons and labels and things like that, and then we'll build up to adding Google APIs and Facebook APIs, etc., and saving those values to user defaults and to core data and eventually to Firebase. So lesson one is the storyboard, and what we need to do is in Xcode we need to open a new project, and we're going to choose a single view app. We're going to go next. We're going to call it one storyboard. We're going to add the use core data. We won't be using that today, but we want to do it now. We're not going to worry about unit testing. And we'll just save that on the desktop. We'll create our Git repository. And we'll get rid of our launch screen. And we'll move some things around. So I'll move our main storyboard to the top. We will create a new group from the selection, which we're going to call view controllers. We're going to move our info plist up under our app delegate, and you'll see this __ storyboard. This is where our core data goes. We won't be looking at that today, but that's what the file's for. And assets are things like our app icon and pictures. Okay, so let's look at our main storyboard, and we have a single view controller that's already there by default. And let's look at what we can do. So on the right hand side here, this is how we can add items to our storyboard, and we want to add a text item. We just drag that onto the storyboard and release it, and we want to create well, we'll stay with that one first. So over here on the right hand side we have the identity inspector, and here we have the attributes inspector, and those two inspectors allow us to change various things to do with the controls. So for our username, we want to use some placeholder text, and we're going to put email in there. We also want to center it. And down here in the text inputs, there's a whole heap of things that you can do. Our content type is going to be an email address, and we don't want to have capitalization because it's an email address. We also don't want to have any of these other things, although we might want to type the keyboard type as an email address. So that is our username text item. Now, the human interface guidelines for Apple state that if you have placeholder text, i.e. we've got email in there, there's no need to put a label. So we don't put a label. Now, if we want to create a second text field, we can copy this up to here like that, and the lines come up on the screen so that they're all aligned and the like. And then that one we want to set to be a password. So again, in the placeholder text, we'll type password. And under the content type, we'll say that it's a password. And we don't want capitalization. Keyboard type, we just want a default keyboard type. We do want to center the text. So people are going to enter in an email and a password, and at some stage, do we want to remember the password, i.e. do we want to auto log on? So we'll take this switch control, we'll bring it out onto the screen, and the switch just looks like that. It doesn't have a label, so we'll find a label. We just type label at the bottom to make things a bit easier for us, and we can align the label, resize it a little bit. We will right justify the label, and up here it doesn't say placeholder text, but it does have the label text, and so we want to call this auto login. The default setting should be off under the human interface guidelines because you don't want people to auto log in unless they specifically opt in for that behavior. And then the final thing we need is a button. And so we choose the button, move it down here on the right hand side. And again, we need to find where it is that we can, there it is. We need to rename the button, so the button title will be create or log in. So it does one of two things. Okay, now in terms of general human interface guidelines, things that you should know are people normally read from the top left and to the bottom right, and so your workflow, if people are filling in a form or anything like that, should start at the top and move down here towards the bottom. If you've got other things which are not important, then you can put them up in this corner, such as a settings icon, or down in this corner, such as a cancel button. So that's, I suppose, one of the main things that you need to understand when it comes to interface guidelines and what things are doing. So people here would fill in the email address, fill in the password, they'd decide whether or not they want to auto log in or not, and then they would click the create or login button. So that gives a really easy flow for people to figure out without any instructions what they need to do. Their best guess is start from here and move down to here. So now what we need to do is constrain all of these fields and place them where we want them to be on multiple sizes of screens that we have available to us and that we need to support. You're not going to write an iOS application for just the iPhone 7 or just the iPhone 6. You are going to do it on iPhones of all sizes and descriptions, as well as ones that don't even exist yet. And so we need to lay out these items in such a way that they will look correct on every screen size that they appear. Now, just point out that on the left-hand side here, under our View Controller scheme, all of the items that we've created have been added on this left-hand side. There's also the View Controller, the First Responder, and the Exit button, which we'll come to later. And then down here, we've got the various different views that we can see our screen size in. So we've got the 4S, we've got the SE, or the 6 I think is the same size, we've got the 7 and the 7 Plus, and then we've got some tablets getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In addition, we can also rotate our screen and rotate back. And this gives us a quick way that we can check that our fields are, or our controls I should say, are actually in the right place on every screen and possibility that we need. In addition, if you need more space, up here in the right hand corner there are these how to show navigators, and we won't need the navigator because we're only remaining within the storyboard, and we can bring it back just by clicking on it. And on the right hand side there's a selection for the inspectors, and we will need those, so I'll need to keep those on the screen. Okay, so getting on to layouts. So you click on one item, and then down here, this is the way I do it, it says add new constraints, and constraints are basically a way of describing the page for each item. So you constrain each item, and it can be difficult to figure out what you're going to do, but what I do is I want to define the width and the height to be constant. I don't want them to rescale, and so I make my width's 200 and my height's 30, and then I want this item to be a certain distance from the top, and I want it to be a certain distance from the left, and I add those 4 constraints. Then if we go over here, you will see that the constraints of width 200 and height 30 have been added. Those are specific to that email text field, and then down here we have another constraints item where it says email leading, which is what is leading this to the left, and we have email top, which is how much space is from the top. Now, I don't want to use either of those values. What I want to do is, for the top, I want it to be from the center of the y-axis, and I want it to be equal to the safe area center y, and I want it to be a constant of -40. So that's basically putting, here's my y position, and it's putting me just above the, so this is our y-axis, and it's putting me 40 pixels above the middle of the y-axis. And then the same with this side here. I want it to be center x, and I want it to be equal to center x, and then I want it to be right in the middle, so I'm not going to vary that position by any negative or positive value. And that is going to place my email exactly where I want it. So let's move all these other things out of the way. And let's talk about our password. We'll go down here again and add some new constraints. Now what I want to do is I still want to have the width and height as 230. However, I want to be 16 pixels, because 16 is a magic number, below the space to my nearest neighbor. So I want to be 16 pixels below the email text, and I'll put that in there as well. I'll add my 4 constraints. I'll click on this constraint here, and I will do what I did with email, and I will change that to center X, and I'll get rid of that constant. And now my email is going to be in the center. It's the same height and width as the email, and it's going to be 16 pixels below. So no matter which of these icons I choose, my email is always going to be, change my orientation, it won't do that. Has it crashed? Oh no, it's just thinking about it. Okay. It's always going to be working in a nifty way. So let's get back to this. So now we've got our switch item. Again, I want to add some constants. I want it to be, there's that magic number 16. I want it to be right bounded because I want it to align up with the right hand side of this password item. And then I'm going to give it a height and a width. I'll give it a height of 30 and a width of 60. I'll add those 4 constraints. Now, what I want to do is when I go to switch, we've got height and width, password, we've got height and width, so they're all looking good. Down here, oh, here we go, safe area.trailing. Okay, so the trailing area of the switch, we don't want it to be based off the safe area. We want it to be the same as password, and we don't want it to be -27. We want it to be 0, I think. That makes sense. And so here we've located the switch. It's going to be the height and width that we want it to be, and it's always going to be magically 16 pixels below password, and it's always going to right align with the password field. So that's that one done. Then we have our auto login, and that we want to place here. And essentially what we'll do again is we will bound the height and width. Let's make it a width of 100. Now something you should consider when you're setting all these things up is that the words that you use here could be much longer in a foreign language, and so you should always have additional space available so that when your language is localized, or when your text is localized, you've got sufficient space, you don't need to redo your layout. So always have the space that you need. The height of a label by default is 21, so that's fine. What we want is we want it to be bounded above by, oh, maybe not 16, maybe it is 21, because this is not 30 in height, and we want it to be centered against this switch, and we want it to be 16 from the right, which gives us a nice little buffer and a consistent buffer, 16, and we'll go add 4 constraints, and that looks good. And then our create a login button, we want to be somewhere up there. And again, we want to have a 16 buffer to the top and a 16 buffer to the right, which we're going to override. We'll have our height, let's make it 150. We'll add those 4 constraints, and let's find this constraint. And again, we'll align it with password. So the first item is, it is going to be trailing, but it's going to be trailing password. The constraint is going to be 0, and that's right hand moved us across. So if you didn't quite pick it up, every time you constrain a single item, if you use 4 constraints and 4 correct constraints, then that will fully constrain an object. That's how constraining works on the storyboard. And essentially what I do is I work from one item, and then I make everything else work off that one space. So my password, I want to be right aligned with email. My auto login, or my switch, I want to be aligned with password. My auto login, I want to be in the corner of these 2 items. And my create a login button, I want to be in the bottom right hand corner of this group of items. So that's how I work the workflow, and it seems to work for me. It's really, really confusing using auto layout. You really need to spend some time trying to master it, but that is the formula that I use to get things working. And then the next trick that I use is I just define any 4 constants. You can just define those 4 if you'd like to get 4 constants on this side, and then I click on them and I manually change them based on what I want and the constants here, and then I can see things, things changing on the screen. Gives me that visual sort of feedback. Finally, you don't need to use storyboards at all. And in a future episode, I'll show you how you can do all of this in code so that you can get rid of the storyboard. Now that we've got graphically what we want on our storyboard, we need to link it to some code. So let's see how that can be done in the next part. Okay, so we've got our pretty storyboard with all the controls that we want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to source control and I'm going to commit that. I'm going to add all that. I haven't created anything up on GitHub currently, so this is just going to save to the local Git repository. And I'm going to say storyboard and constraints complete. Okay, I'm going to open back up the the file inspector over here, and what we need to do is play around a little bit. Over here we have what's called the assistant editor. So we click on that and it opens two windows, and all we've got to do is get rid of that one on the left, and this is our view controller. So all the code for this view controller is going to go into this file viewcontroller.swift, and by holding down the option key, if you hold down the option key, you will copy the item. If you hold down the control key, you can create an outlet. We want to name the outlet email text. It's going to be a text field, and you want it to be weak. We'll make a little bit of space. Again, we do this for every item. Control, and it's going to be password text. We've got a label, control drag. We're going to call it login label. We've got a switch. I'm going to call that auto login switch. Again, it's a UI switch. And then we're going to grab this button. We're going to call this login button. Now, the other thing we want to do is, well, essentially what all these outlets allow us to do is to, it's creating a weak reference to each of these items on the storyboard, and that allows us to access their values. So we're going to want at some stage to get the value of this email text, the text component, so that we can save it. Same with the password. This auto login function, where you might think, well, it's a label, it's not going to change, but we might want to change the words associated with it. The switch and the button. Now, when the switch is flicked, the interface will automatically turn it from off to on, but we might want to do some code. We might want to update the screen when that change occurs, and the button, that also we might want to do something there. In fact, we are definitely going to want to do something with the button. So we'll hold down our control key, and down the bottom we will create not an outlet but an action, and the type of the action is going to be for a UI button, and we're going to call this the login button. Now we can close our assistant editor, or just by clicking on the main editor. And if you're wondering what this arrow is over here, that's our version editor, and that's if you want to change between various versions that you've saved, etc. It's rarely used, although it may be used a lot more now that GitHub is fully integrated with Xcode 9. But anyway, moving back to our code, now we go to our view controller, and we can see that these outlets have been created. The term IB outlet or interface builder outlet, that is essentially creating a class of type UI text field or UI label, whatever the definition is here. It's basically a variable declaration, and these IB actions or interface builder actions, these are functions. So for conformity, we place all of the outlets at the top with our other variables, and we place all of the actions at the bottom with our other functions. One thing I will show you is when we're in the storyboard and you're on a screen, if you go to this little arrow, that's the connections inspector, and that will show you that the referencing outlets for the different text fields that you have. And what you can do, or what can happen, but what you shouldn't do, is when you're creating these outlets, you might create them as the wrong type of item, particularly buttons. If you create another one, as an action, the default type is any, and if you create that, it says the sender is any, not a UI button. You might think, oh dear, this is going to cause me some problems, and so you just delete it here. If you look at the items inspector, it's still got this connection here, view controller new button, even though we've deleted it in the source, and that's going to cause massive problems. So we just need to remove that. So just be aware that if you make some error here, it's not as simple as just deleting it or even editing the source code here. Delete it and delete it here within this connections inspector, and then you won't have any problems. So that'll save you some time. Hopefully you now have a good grasp of the basics for storyboards and constraints. I suggest you play around with the various different control types and read some of the human interface guidelines on the Apple Developer website. In the next lessons, we're going to be learning how to save data persistently between sessions with user defaults and core data. If you have any questions about this tutorial, then please leave a comment below or hit me up on Twitter @SwiftAlmanac. Please subscribe to the channel, it's free, and check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.